Today I'm going to share my editing workflow for digital image files. So this represents years and years of struggle and pain to figure out how to do things without losing quality. So data fidelity is really important, and we're going to use a very specific order of operations to deal with these files. So the first thing we're going to do is open Adobe Bridge, and within the Bridge interface we're going to navigate to the folder with the image files that we're going to deal with today. So I'm going deep into my hard drive and pulling out these photos from 2015. They're taken on a Nikon, so they're .nef files. Canon camera will produce .cr2 files. You can mess with the editing spaces, the workspaces in Adobe Bridge, so I just like changing the size of the panels and the thumbnails. You can also use this zoom feature to check resolution. I hate that resolution check, so what I'm going to do is select all these images, right click, and select Open in Camera Raw. So this is going to pop up a second dialog box where we're going to do most of our editing here. So I'm going to select all those images again. They're all open, but I want to select them all again and make this first initial change. This is a change that I'm always going to make on top of all my files, which is remove chromatic aberration and enable profile correction. So you can see that Camera Raw is actually registering the lens you use to take the photos. This only works on raw image files, but it's automatically adjusting the photos for that specific lens profile, which is pretty cool. So it gets rid of the fisheye, and also it brightens up the images a little bit, so I like to do that first before I do anything else. The first thing we need to do is a resolution check. So there's like many different editorial criteria that we're going to reduce the amount of images down with. The first one is resolution. Like we were talking about, you can't fix resolution in post or in editing. I wish you could. But you sure can't. So I like the zoom feature in Camera Raw a lot better than that one we were looking at in Bridge, because it allows you to zoom in as close as you want to, and pan across the screen with the hand tool. So to make this a little quicker, you can use hotkeys. You can use H for hand and Z for zoom. You can also mess with those things, like you can mess with the zoom in the bottom left hand to zoom in and out. Depending on how fast your computer is, your like graphics card or whatever, I don't know. These things will take a minute to like load. Like they might look very pixelated, and then you just have to wait a minute for the file to load because it's very large. So as we go through here, I'm making sure that these images are passing my resolution check. This looks bad. It looks bad back here. But you have to keep in mind with these images, these couple of images here that are like more diagonally oriented, there's like a depth of field issue. So because they're objects really far away and really close up, it's kind of impossible to have everything in perfect crisp resolution. So I just want to make sure that they're resolved in the fields where I want them to be resolved. And when I'm making these decisions, I'm starring the images that pass the resolution check. So there's a few different kinds of labels that you can use. I just use stars because they're quick and easy. So as I select an individual image, the option will come up for me to add a rating to it. And so usually I add 5 stars for something that's like in great resolution, and 1 star for images I hate and I know I want to delete, etc. So when I finish my resolution check, click done for Camera Raw, and that'll kind of close that feature and bring you back to Bridge. And now I'm going to select all the images that didn't pass the test, and I'm going to delete them. A thing that you need to know about Bridge is when I delete them right here, they're actually deleting the images on the hard drive on my computer. And so if you're not ready to commit to that, I suggest that you make a duplicate folder before you start doing these types of edits, and make sure that you're confident in your decision before you delete the files completely. I'm just making a few more compositional edits right now. I just hate these photos, and I'm gonna delete them because I don't want to do all of the editing work on top of images that I don't like. So after I delete those, I am now happy with a pretty small batch of photos that are all well resolved and are all sort of doing different things compositionally. So I'm going to select them all and open them again in Camera Raw. And so in this window, we're going to do all of these sort of visual edits. Bridge is going to be the space I'm going to do those edits in. And what I mean by that is like white balance and exposure and things like that. So as we go into the real folder on the computer, what Bridge is doing is producing these sidecar files. It looks like a blank file. It's a .xmp file. And so it's not actually editing on top of the raw file, but it's producing this sidecar file that holds all the metadata edits. So don't delete those. We need those. When we go back into this interface, we have all these options for like sliders for visual editing. And I'm going to just go through real quick what each of them mean and which ones I use. So we've got our white balance up top. You have temperature and tint. You can also do an auto white balance, but I don't trust auto anything. I don't trust a computer to do what my eyes can do personally, so I always balance those manually. Temperature, like blue versus yellow scale, you can make more dramatic adjustments than the tint scale, which is like a green to magenta slider. Those adjustments tend to be more dramatic to my eye, and the goal here is to make images that look sort of effortless, right? So we're going to struggle very hard in this editing process, but hopefully it produces images that do not reveal that struggle or look heavily edited. So I'm going to mess around with all these settings to varying degrees. Sometimes I mess with exposure if something is over or underexposed. I try to do very gentle adjustments with contrast because that's another setting that it's easy to make things look very edited. So I try to keep it, maybe under 5 points in either direction. These at the bottom here, vibrance and saturation, I don't mess with too much. Can create really dramatically edited looking photos, so I don't usually touch those unless I have to. Here's a feature that's really cool, which is sync settings. And so I did a lot of work on that first image, and I can just select everything and click sync settings, and you can see those edits applying to all of the other images that I haven't really touched yet, so that can save a ton of time. In this particular situation, the first image I had it was overexposed. The rest of them are not, and so I just redid that sync settings feature and deselected exposure. So that's going to apply all the other editing changes I made without changing the exposure on the rest of these images. If you've taken your images in a very consistent way, the sync settings feature, like you might just need to edit the first one, sync them all, and call it a day. These photos, again, are from like 2015. I had no idea what I was doing. I was just pressing buttons and spinning levers, and so they're all like super inconsistent. So that kind of sucks because I'm going to have to spend all this time individually making changes so that I can make the batch look cohesive. So just to return to the rest of these settings and what you can do with them, you can mess with, we've got exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks in the middle here. Again, I mess with exposure as needed. Contrast, try to keep it gentle. Highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, you can make like pretty dramatic adjustments there without the images looking overly edited. And I use those sliders a ton with this batch because the objects are black and white, so they're sort of like either end of the spectrum, and it's a little bit tough to make both of those objects look good at the same time. So I can strategically use highlights and shadows to balance those out. I think in that first image I took the highlights down to -100, so that's like the maximum you can possibly do, and I feel okay about that. So highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, you can make more dramatic changes. The rest of the sliders are texture, clarity, and dehaze. Don't touch them. Don't do that. We don't need to. So after I'm done sort of like messing with all of these, I'm gonna open them in Lightroom. So the metadata is automatically saving from Bridge, and then when I open Lightroom, the workflow is a little bit different because I'm not just working right on top of the folder, the files in the folder. I actually have to import the files into the Lightroom workspace. So what I can do is I can navigate in the same way that I did with Bridge, or I can just grab my folder and drag the images in. So when I do this, I want to make sure that I am also dragging in the .xmp files. That's the metadata. You need that for the edits that you just made in Bridge to register in Lightroom. So we're going to wait for these to upload, and you'll see how the XMP files are going to sort of be laid on top of the raw files. So you'll see that happen in real time. You'll see the white balance adjust and all those edits kick in. So that is great. And then once we're ready to work with them, we go up here to develop, and all of these settings on the right hand side are the same as in the camera raw interface, and they reflect the edits that we just did in Bridge. You can edit those a little bit in Lightroom, but because we're not working directly on top of the files, we're working on like an uploaded version of them, we're gonna have to sync the settings. I'll show you how to do that later. But I use Lightroom for compositional and formatting changes. So what that means is cropping, and I think the tool in Lightroom is far superior, and that is because as you sort of balance things and rotate them, it actually moves the image file underneath. You see it moves the file underneath the frame rather than the other way around. In Camera Raw, it moves the frame and not the image, and that's like so difficult for my eye to adapt to. So I use Lightroom pretty exclusively for cropping, and I think it's worth it. And so you can see also you can change the aspect ratios if you want. Sometimes it's nice to play around with those depending on what you have made pictures of. Like for this one, this stack is like quite wide and horizontal, so I can mess with an aspect ratio that's more like, I think this is like a 16:9. I can play with that and see how it feels. In general, I try to keep my aspect ratios consistent throughout the batch. Sometimes this can be helpful for if you're uploading a group of photos to your website, on a gallery page, or like for an exhibition application, or for like a social media multi-post. Sometimes the aspect ratio needs to match, but it's not a hard and fast rule, and sometimes the images is just going to look better with a different aspect ratio. So something to keep in mind. Another tool that I like to use in Lightroom is the spot treatment tool. It's just really quick and easy. You can select it and then scroll on your mouse to change the size, or go into the settings to change the size. And you can also do this in Photoshop, but I don't want to involve another program unless I have to. So Lightroom's spot treat tool is pretty good. What it does is it actually pulls some information from a different part of the image, and it'll show you where it's pulling from, and you can actually change the source patch if you want to. But Lightroom is pretty good at integrating pretty seamlessly, so I don't usually have issues with that. You can also see, you can always like Control Z or Command Z or whatever, but on the left hand side in Lightroom there's a history menu, and so as you make changes it'll record all of those changes, and you can go as far back as you'd like to the point that the image was at when you imported it. So that's really great. The history feature is really great. And I'm just going to continue to go through my crop editing process. And when I'm done with that, what I need to do is save the metadata on top of these files. Just a little bit different than working with Bridge because we have these photos imported, so they're not, the metadata isn't saving automatically on top of them the same way that it is in Bridge. So this is important for these last phases of editing because I like to bounce back and forth, I guess, between Bridge and Lightroom to make these sort of like last minute minute changes. And you just need to know how to transfer your metadata and make sure that the changes are staying current between the two programs. So it's not hard, but all that you have to remember is that you have to manually do things in Lightroom and it'll automatically update in Bridge. So when I'm done with these changes, I'm going to select, go to metadata and click save metadata to files, and continue. And the really cool thing about cropping is that cropping is actually a metadata change, and that's exciting because it's not erasing information from the raw file. It's just laying like a crop frame on top of it. So if, for example, you come in 6 years later and you still have the raw file and the metadata file and you're like, wow, that's a really terrible crop, you can recrop it, and that's awesome. So when I go back into Bridge, you see I just had to like click out and back into the folder. Sometimes it doesn't show up immediately, but those metadata changes have applied to the file. The crops have applied to those files. So I'm just going to look at them again and kind of make a few more changes if I want to. It's nice to select all the images. Sometimes in a group you can see, oh wow, like this one looks a lot more dim than the rest, so maybe nudge the exposure just a hair. And I'm going to do just a few different changes that I'm seeing that, I don't really like the way that this one's balanced. So this is the crop tool in Camera Raw, and you can see when I do the rotate, it moves the frame around the image. So I just hate that. So now I'm going to go back into Lightroom. And so for that metadata change to show up, I need to import it basically. So I go and I click on this exclamation point and it'll say the metadata has been changed. So you go import the settings from the disk. If you click overwrite, then it's going to like overwrite the settings that Lightroom has. So it'll just, undo that change that you made in Bridge. So just keep in mind when you're bouncing back and forth, keep it in your brain recorded what changes you made in what program. Whenever you leave a program, make sure you're like importing those changes into Lightroom or exporting them from Lightroom. Another tool that is really great in Bridge is the rename tool, file rename tool. So I just selected all these files and went up to tools, rename, and I'm going to call them shells _ number sequence. And so it just helps to have a descriptive title, makes your files more searchable. And I'm going to rename the files. And so now they're, shells, number sequence. But then this creates a problem back in Lightroom because when you rename a file, it no longer shows up in Lightroom. So I just removed those lost files and I'm going to re-import them under their new names. And it's exactly the same deal. The metadata will register on top of those image files. And from here, what we're going to use Lightroom to do, this is probably hands down the most valuable feature of Lightroom, is the formatting and export features. So I can select all of these images and I can batch export them. The first thing that I usually do is I create a subfolder in the original folder for a TIFF file. A TIFF file is basically like a lossless, high-quality file that incorporates the metadata into the raw image and produces one flat image, so you won't be able to make the same types of metadata changes. There's not that flexibility there, but it will produce a singular image file, which is really helpful. If you're done with your editing, you're ready to commit, make a folder of TIFF files, and then from there you can export either from the TIFF files or from the raw files into a JPEG. You never want to export a JPEG from a JPEG because you're losing quality every time you do that. So I'm gonna export and just show you some options for JPEG, like quality and restrictions. Lightroom is amazing. It gives you so many different options for export, and you can rename, but it'll rename the exported files only. It won't rename the originals, which can be helpful. So I'm gonna go down here and, like maybe I'm making a portfolio and I need it to be like Fedorshak Lalana _ number sequence, so I can make it rename my portfolio like that, or there's a whole bunch of different features in the file naming options. For the format, if we change to JPEG, we have all these other options. So I can change the size of the images, so I'm changing it to 2,000 kilobytes. 1,000 kilobytes is a megabyte, just so you know. And don't worry about color space. I think I use sRGB or Adobe RGB. Resolution wise, you never want to go below 150 pixels per inch or dots per inch. And you can also select this option to resize the long edge to a specific amount of pixels. These features are super helpful when you're uploading a portfolio for an application for something, because they usually have like very specific requirements for size, for resolution, for like DPI, for like a long edge restriction, and for a file size too. So you can go in, take all your files and, group format them in one fell swoop, which is awesome, so helpful. And so this is what my original folder looks like now. I have this new folder with the TIFF images in there. These are really big, high quality files that I can export from. And then I have this folder full of the JPEGs. And so I can go in here and just open them in like Windows Media Viewer, and then I can look at the what the reduced quality looks like. Sometimes it kind of makes the editing a bit more dramatic. And when I'm done, I can remove the images from Lightroom. As long as I don't click delete from disk, I'm fine to just remove those from the library, and I can just close Bridge and I am all set.